embody the whole truth. About how metaphors and the stories that we embody our metaphors in shape our thought processes. They're really powerful things, metaphors. They shape and form our underlying motivations and worldview. But they do that in ways that it can be very hard to bring into our full consciousness. That it's that kind of thing where you say everyone knows that this is how things are. And so they can be very hard to critique. So some of what I say might seem very obvious, but hopefully there are some things that we can just bring to the surface, particularly in terms of how some of these underlying biblical metaphors and theological metaphors have shaped and formed the ways that the churches have thought about mission and how perhaps we've thought about mission. Some of these metaphors might be ones that you've rejected, and let's have a think about that and about what might still be useful in them. So I'm primarily going to talk about 4 key metaphors for mission that underlie a lot of the biblical and historical Christian understandings of mission that have been very dominant in shaping the Christian church's understanding and practices of mission and evangelism historically, and that I think are still very powerful today but aren't very acknowledged today in shaping what it is that we think about mission. Quick romp through some theory initially. There's a classic view of mission in Christian history. Any of you who've been to theological college or done a theology degree will no doubt have heard of Hans Kung and Bosch. And in that typology sees the history of Christianity in 6 distinct and successive epochs or paradigms, which each have their own particular approach to mission and the task of church growth. They're up there. So first of all, the apocalyptic primitive paradigm. The phrase "the world is ending, get in the ark" is not Kung or Bosch. That's my characterisation of this. It's a metaphor, an image that has a real panic about it. You know, the world is about to end. Get in the ark quick, or you're not going to be part of the people that are saved. Historically, that's seen as succeeded by the Hellenistic paradigm in one of the Reader's Guides to Bosch that's described as good ideas about life and love. It's a very philosophical view where there's a lot of thoughtfulness given about how best to live. And then he talks about the medieval Roman Catholic paradigm, which Bosch describes as primarily being in terms of Christendom, in terms of defending the borders of the territory that's Christian, and perhaps towards the end of this period beginning to think about expanding it. The assumption being that everyone within that territory is Christian. I think that's actually a little bit inaccurate, but we might come on to that. And then the Reformation paradigm, justification by faith, which focused on proclamation and preaching, in which right belief became increasingly important. And then finally, in the modern era, by 2 more complex sets of ideas, the Enlightenment and what Bosch calls an emerging ecumenical paradigm, which are too complicated to summarise on a slide. So, I'm not going to today to suggest an alternative set of sequential historical divisions or paradigms. The metaphors that I want to talk about today, I think, run across that whole time period and in fact shape and interplay with a lot of those different things. So in a way, having shown you that, you can ignore it, but I thought it was important to acknowledge it. And the first metaphor I want to talk about is the one that I think has the longest pedigree, and I'm going to talk about it in most detail just to kind of show you the kind of way my thinking's working, really. I think it is still the most powerful metaphor in a lot of the way that we talk about mission today, and particularly in a lot of the way that conservative evangelicalism talks about mission today, and that's the metaphor of rescue. That we are rescuing people from damnation or whatever. It obviously is a theme that has very powerful biblical roots, and it's dominant in a lot of theology, both of the atonement and our own church mission. It goes back, of course, at least as far as the Exodus story, and so it's foundational for much of the Hebrew scriptures and for much of our contemporary theology. That phrase in our contemporary liturgy, from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the promised land. It's a very powerful image that speaks dramatically and repeatedly to us as we become aware of more and more things that we are metaphorically enslaved to. One of the things that Mark has been working on over the last few months has been versions of the 12-step programme, helping people to deal with things that they find themselves addicted to. So there is still a lot of power and reality to this idea of being enslaved and wanting freedom. But there are various different sub-themes or angles to this metaphor that I want to draw out. Firstly, of course, and most importantly, it assumes that we are in need of rescue. And there have been different times, at different times in Christian history, there have been different emphases, different interpretations of what exactly we're being rescued from or rescued to. But the core image is the same. We're trapped, we're enslaved, or we're oppressed. We can't help ourselves, we need an external rescuer to come and free us. That's the founding metaphor for a lot of theologies of atonement. It's also, of course, the basic theme of most fairy tales, and I don't think that's coincidental. I think of Sleeping Beauty, asleep in the tower, the hapless, passive victim of a curse, waiting the heroic activity of the prince, slashing his way through the brambles to come and rescue her. Or Cinderella, marginalised by her family, awaiting the arrival of the prince with the glass slipper. And there's been a really strong feminist literary critique of the fairy tale genre, which has been very helpful in recent years in helping us to identify the way in which this fundamental theme of being in need of rescue has been gendered and individualised throughout history. And that's been the case very much in mission theology, both formal and informal. You can see it in the leadership models that we often presented with today. The idea of the charismatic leader riding in on his white charger to come and rescue a church. And you still see that in lots of adverts in the church times, whether they're for vicars or for youth workers or whatever. We need someone to come and do this for us because we are helpless without you. A lot of the way in which Jesus is conceptualised in the New Testament text and in later theology as the new Moses very deliberately riffs on this theme of the charismatic leader coming in to save the people. So too, of course, does much popular political theology. We, the people, are held captive by powerful interests, whether that's Pharaoh, the devil, the forces of capitalism, whatever else we're particularly worried about at the time. Perhaps today in our rhetoric, overwhelming immigration. And we need a rescuer, Moses, Jesus, Jeremy Corbyn, whatever political leader you choose to pick, to save us, because we're helpless to save ourselves. And of course, one of the key dangers of this metaphor is that it encourages an essentially passive approach to faith and life, where we sit there waiting for someone to come and save us. Our role, and the role of ourselves in mission, our role is to await and then gratefully receive that rescue. And so if this is the founding metaphor for mission, mission becomes primarily about making people aware of their need for rescue so that they can ask for it and then gratefully receive it. It becomes a bit like old-fashioned advertising, you know, the old BO adverts that created the concept of BO in order to sell a product. And so it takes us back to what people earlier were saying about consumerism. One of the most radical aspects of liberation theology's roots in Latin America and the base communities there was its insistence that it was the people themselves whose wisdom, strength and theological resources would save them from their theological oppression and their economic oppression, not external agencies, however well-meaning. And that challenges at its heart the way this metaphor of rescue and exodus has been used and heard for thousands of years. And if you try rereading Exodus, looking out for the agency of others, from the Hebrew midwives onwards, you can quickly see that that idea that Moses is this totemic male hero that we need to save us is not the only way of reading that story. It's very liberating. So I don't think we want to entirely abandon this metaphor, but liberation rather than rescue is a much more helpful, a much more productive and fruitful way of framing it, I think. It's true that we often feel, or objectively are, enslaved, trapped, oppressed, in all sorts of different ways. And it's true that we want freedom from that. But sitting there waiting for a hero on a white charger is not, I think, the most productive way to think about how that rescue and liberation is going to come. There are some other things that I want to just note briefly in relation to this story. When you look at the Exodus story, of course, one of the interesting things is that the image of being saved through the desert. It's not the desert that we're saved from. And the desert obviously symbolises all sorts of things in terms of desolation, loss, or simply the passage of time. But we're saved through those things rather than from them. That can also shape theories of mission in helpful or unhelpful ways. It can be a helpful antidote, for example, to prosperity gospel ideas, unrealistically promising perfect happiness and success. But it can also be used abusively to encourage people to see any experience of oppression or suffering as a kind of God-given desert experience, rather than as something that should rightly be challenged. There's also some interesting questions about the images of slavery and freedom and how they're used. They're helpfully reimagined in liberation theology and in kingdom theology. But there is a danger of who we identify as the enslavers, who we see as doing the enslaving. If we simply identify the forces of oppression that we're talking about as Pharaoh, we can very easily demonise them, and it can quickly become again one of those them and us narratives. It's quite instructive to read through Exodus imagining ourselves as the Egyptians. So reading it as a story about enslavement and liberation, but not simply assuming that we're on the side of the good guys, can be quite helpful. Note also, I think this is my last point about this one, yes, that when the Israelites are rescued in that story from economic and political oppression, when they're living happily ever after in the Promised Land eventually, the story goes on to tell us that they very often become political and economic oppressors themselves. That's what the prophets are continually criticising them for. So if we take the story longer, it tells us something about the shadow side of this concept of being rescued, that we might very easily replicate the systems of oppression that we've been rescued from, either from fear, if I'm not in charge then someone else is going to be, or from an inability to imagine any other system. It's really easy for all that changes to be who's at the top, rather than the whole concept of there being a top and a bottom. So I wonder whether if we extend the metaphor of Exodus, and instead of just going, once upon a time people were led from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land and then they all lived happily ever after, but in fact see what happened afterwards, whether that helps us to explore some of the complexities of human systems and the psychologies of oppression. And I think those ways in which we are now more aware of scientific and psychological realities, one of the things that as liberal theologians we're willing to do is to take those insights into our theology. Then actually critiquing these sort of stories and metaphors from the point of view of what do they actually say with those insights can be really interesting. What might that mean for our mission? I do think that problematising our stories, problematising our metaphors is a real gift that we bring. It's easy for it to be seen as simply a negative thing, but I think realising and raising to the surface some of the issues and problems we have with our biblical texts redeems them. Some of these stories are awful. You know, there are some real problems with a lot of these stories, and we need to be honest about that. Absolutely honest about that. And then we can start the much more interesting question and discussion. Well, what does it tell us about then? If we're furious at that story, maybe the point of the story being in the Bible is that we're meant to be made furious by that, because that's really wrong. Anyway, moving on. Second metaphor I want to talk about is battle. In some ways it might be a bit of a subset of the first. The idea of battling, of fighting against something. Again, a metaphor that occurs throughout the Bible has shaped a lot of our theology. The people of Israel presented as battling for survival and distinctiveness against other nations threatening to engulf them. Something again we're hearing again in our current political theology. It's been a very powerful shaping metaphor throughout Christian history, from obvious and crude examples like the Crusades to the more nuanced way in which it's used as a founding metaphor for things like the Salvation Army. It's easy for us to see the negative side of this kind of image. It induces a feeling of panic. This is life or death. It easily feeds into and promotes a polarised them and us view of the world, and we all know how destructive that has been and continues to be. So it may well be a metaphor that you find hard to view positively, and I'm not going to suggest that you should, but there is some element of positivity in it, because it can be an image of human energy, passion and strength, even of toxic masculinity and the male tendency to violence, being directed and channelled helpfully to protect the vulnerable. You can see this kind of use of the image in the way the popular imagination characterises the battle against cancer. That can be very unhelpful on an individual level. You know, oh, you've got cancer, you better fight. bravely. Whether or not you beat it is down to your own resources of how strong you are. Not helpful. But you can see it on a societal level, as charities, for example, often evoke this kind of imagery. Come and join us in the fight against cancer. Evoking a kind of blitz spirit, tear up your railings and send them off to the researchers in the lab who'll turn them into magic bullets. Whether what's being battled against is literal enemies or metaphorical enemies, ignorance, poverty, injustice or disease, this is a really powerful metaphor. And it's a metaphor that provides a very strong motivation for mission of all kinds, charitable and humanitarian as well as theological. You hear it in things like the war on drugs, the war on want. It can galvanise support, but of course the dangers are obvious. In an evangelistic context, it's a hugely tainted concept. The horrors of religiously motivated violence are too deeply embedded in our consciousness for this to be a neutral image. And I think the fact that this is such a strong metaphor and has such a strong capacity to galvanise support means we can't ethically use this when the targets are people, rather than whether or not you could argue, I think, whether you can use it in terms of battling against abstract or impersonal evils like poverty or disease. I don't think it is ever ethical to use this image when you're talking about people. We know that the use of this imagery tends to dehumanise and lead to violence. That's obviously sometimes exactly why it's used, but in many cases that's not the aim, but it's, I think, an inevitable side effect. There's also a really practical issue with this metaphor, which is that it can be very, very demoralising. If you see life, or you see your call to evangelise, as a battle, you're setting yourself up to fail. It's not a battle we are ever going to win. And I suspect that for some at least, the unacknowledged shaping of their self-understanding by this metaphor is a major cause of burnout and disillusionment, so avoid it. That's my tip. The third one I want to talk about is healing. I heard about this a bit in Martin's talk. A much more positive word and image in our culture, a key metaphor in Jesus' ministry, and also a key metaphor in the medieval Catholic Church. The sacraments were conceptualised as medicine for the soul. If you were sick in body, you needed a doctor. If you were soul sick, you needed a priest. And that applies whether you see the sickness as sin, or something much more acceptable to modern ears, like soul sickness or consumerism or a sense of the emptiness of life. It's not just Christian churches that operate using this metaphor. Most of the contemporary self-help industry finds this incredibly powerful way of selling books. Concepts such as mindfulness operate primarily out of this concept of healing us from our diseases. I think this is a metaphor for mission. The opposite, in a way, of the first one we looked at, rescue, which makes the recipient very passive, wait to be rescued. This one makes the church very passive. If this is the metaphor that shapes your mission, then the church is effectively a specialist, like a doctor, that will sit in their surgery waiting to be sought out by those that need it. And the idea that some people have, that we sit in churches waiting for people to come and see us or waiting for people to ring us up and tell us that they need a visit, is essentially shaped by this idea that there are experts in the church who can be called on when their services are required. Now, on the positive side, this respects the agency and wishes of others. Jesus never healed unasked, and sometimes when people called out to him for help, and it looked obvious what their problem was, he still asked them, "What do you want me to do for you?" This kind of waiting to be asked can be a sign that we're respectful of other people's choice and agency. We don't assume that we know what's best for them. We wait for them to make the first move. On the other hand, healing as a guiding metaphor for mission does have a shadow side, various shadow sides. Obviously, there's the whole issue of it assuming that we're the experts and have the keys to the medicine cabinet. We've heard quite a bit about that this morning, so I won't go into that. When it's harnessed to consumerism, it can very easily lead to the religious and spiritual equivalent of quackery or being a snake oil salesman, which can be dangerous, fraudulent, or at the very least ineffective. I'm sure we've all heard horror stories of people who were told not to go, stop their cancer treatment because we were going to pray for healing and so on. But even if we don't imagine us going quite to that extent, there's something about assuming that we've got medicine without applying the kind of evidence-based rigour for whether that works or not that we would expect nowadays to apply to we'd expect our doctors to apply it, but we as a church do not seem very often to apply that kind of evidence-based rigour to our own practice and spirituality. When did you last see a peer-reviewed article about comparing the effectiveness of different types of prayer or different types of spirituality? It just doesn't happen. Why not? Quite an interesting question. And also, the shadow side of respecting the individual can be that those who don't have the same access to help or the same belief that they're worth helping can be overlooked. I'm thinking of the way we've become much more aware nowadays of the assumptions of privilege, white privilege, male privilege, middle-class privilege, and so on, which should make us question the basic assumption that those who want help will be able to freely access it. There could, of course, be all sorts of external barriers. There are also internal barriers. You'll probably all have heard the question that people ask of domestic violence victims: why didn't they ask for help? But we know, of course, that if you've been on the receiving end of that kind of abuse, it affects self-confidence, it affects your basic sense that you're worth helping. So respecting people's autonomy can be an excuse for a lack of alertness to the need in front of us. And I think sometimes, as liberal Guardian reading middle classes, I hold my hand up to that, we can be so worried about being seen to have the answers that we can end up not acting when we should act. There's also an inherent danger of this metaphor that it can lead to clericalism, and I do hold my hands up here. I've heard and completely take the criticism that it has all been clergy standing up here today. Sorry about that. We'll do better next time. Because there is a real danger in this metaphor that we assume, and people in churches assume, that this kind of, because it's like being a doctor, it needs to be left to people who are the experts, whether that's in some traditions people with healing gifts, or whether in more formal traditions it's licensed ministers. Which takes us on to the fourth metaphor, which I will do very quickly so we don't get to take up too much of your coffee break. Teaching. Particularly associated with the Protestant Reformation paradigm in Bosch's typology, obviously has much longer roots in the rabbinic tradition and so on. It's a really interesting metaphor because it captures the idea that there is knowledge that it's important to impart to people, that knowing certain things about God and the world, or being encouraged to contemplate such things in a more thoughtful way, will make a difference to people's lives. Now you can take this to a very unhelpful extreme, like the Gnostics, literally seeing the possession and passing on of esoteric information as being what constitutes salvation. And of course, even without going that far, a lot of the theories of mission currently are about creating the right beliefs, the right saving beliefs. It's not enough, is it? Or is it, to trust in God? Does it matter that you have the correct intellectual beliefs about God? And you can see that debate happening throughout the whole of Christian history. The question I want to ask ourselves is how this metaphor of evangelism shapes our own belief and practice. A liberal, progressive approach to Christianity is often fairly intellectually motivated. Certainly is for me. Debunking traditional approaches to religion where they don't stand up to scrutiny anymore, bringing the insights of modern scholarship to bear on our own traditions, our own sacred texts, our own spiritual practices. So for myself, I'm left with a slightly uncomfortable question. It seems to me that one of the key messages I want to communicate to people about God is that God loves us unconditionally, as we've all been saying. Being a Christian isn't something you have to pass some sort of multiple choice exam to get into, to access. I don't think we're saved by a correct faith or condemned by having an incorrect one. But at the same time, I think it really matters that some people are being damaged and hurt by some forms of theology that I don't think are right. And I think the church and the world will be better if those theologies are challenged and corrected. People are, it seems to me, in this life literally being saved, killed, condemned, rescued by harmful or more liberating theologies. How do we hold those two things together? It's a really interesting question. And I do think teaching as a metaphor has somewhere to help us when we look at modern pedagogical theory. Pedagogical, that's quite hard to say. The old-fashioned view of preaching and teaching was that children, and by definition everybody, priest was father, everyone else is children, that everyone was empty vessels to be filled. That's not what the theory and practice of teaching is now. Teachers increasingly see their task as being to help people as independent and capable learners to discover for themselves, whether that's as a play leader in a nursery school or at universities. And I think that has huge implications for our evangelistic practice. Learning is best achieved through experimentation, discussion, and even play. That was the motivation behind my prayer experiment series of books. It seemed bizarre to me that given that experimentation and play is how people are being taught in schools, why are all the books for children about Christianity a series of things that you're meant to assent to? What might playful mission look like? What would it look like if we played at being Christians, played at being evangelists, rather than worried about it all the time and thought of it as this huge, great task that we had to take on, that we hate doing, we grit our teeth and do? What if we just played at it? So those are the four metaphors that I think come out most strongly from the Bible and Christian tradition. There are, of course, lots of others. I haven't talked today about the image of farming and gardening, which I talk about quite a lot in a chapter I wrote in David Goodhue's book, Towards a Theology of Church Growth. It's quite a strong medieval metaphor. There are other metaphors that are less common but might be very futural. Midwifery, for example, bringing new things to birth. I love that idea. Storytelling itself. Storytelling as a metaphor for what our evangelism is. And one that I've begun to see in the last few years, Christianity as an improvised art form, taking inspiration from improvised improv comedy, improv theatre. I've started doing improv quilting. Actually, what does it mean to be improvising on themes? Christianity as being jazz musicians. So the question I've got for you is, what metaphor or image, which could be one of the ones I've talked about today, may well be something completely different, do you think most shapes your approach to mission and evangelism? And that could be positive or negative. It could be, actually, I've found that these metaphors have really negatively impacted how I've thought about evangelism in the past, or it could be a more positive thing. And what metaphors do you think might be most fruitful as we develop positive liberal theologies of evangelism in the future? So, I leave you with that question, invite you to discuss it and put some feedback up on your post-its, and there is coffee available for the next 25 minutes.